Greetings and welcome back. We are in Senior AP English, and our objective now is to continue with our comments on Hamlet, and more particularly Hamlet Act 5. Now, here's the deal. You finished listening to the play just now, and you went back and you took a look at the opening lines of the play. Let's just say it out loud. This is a play about death and dying. It's been a play about death and dying from the very beginning. We just didn't realize it as such. So, for example, the very first major kind of project is to figure out what's going on with a dead man's ghost walking around the battlements. And then from this point on, the play really was about death and dying. But it's only in Act 5 that we finally kind of come to realize that. Now, to appreciate what's going on in Act 5, I got to do a little drawing on the whiteboard so you kind of understand what's going on. During 1600 Shakespeare's day, it was already standard protocol to understood what happened after the person died. Several anthropologists have said that if you really want to understand a culture, study how they celebrate a birth and how they mourn a death. You look at those two activities and that'll tell you a whole lot about what you need to know about a culture. Well, let's talk about during Shakespeare's day how they understood the whole idea of death and burial. Now, the way this worked was you had a church, as represented by X with C. Outside of the church, directly outside of the church, you had a very special sacred kind of ground where certain very holy people could be buried. And then a little further away from the church, you would have another plot of ground where again, it was not the saints, but then the next kind of understanding of holiness. Then you had another plot, which was the rest of the churchyard. Okay? Now, to be buried in this area right here, there are certain ways you could not die. One of those was suicide. Okay? And so you would not be buried, for example, so close to the church if you were buried if you died because you took your own life, okay? Now, the way they would bury is this is just dirt, they would dig a hole and they'd put the body in the ground. Then they'd go next to it, dig a hole, put the body in the ground, here, 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 all the way till they got to right there. Now, when they got right there, they didn't go find new ground. Okay, they didn't go find new ground. We're talking about England. They ain't much ground there to begin with, okay? So what they would do is they would just go right back up to where they started, and then they would just start digging again, and you would bury, and then again, all the way to go, and then when they got here, again, we used the ground 2 times, we're done. No, you would come back, go back up, start all over again, and again, and again, okay? During times of plague, it was not unusual for this plot of ground to be easily used and covered within 1 year, easily, within times of plague. So that when really hard torrential storm rains hit, it was not unusual to walk by one of these graveyards and literally seeing dead body parts sticking out of the ground. That was not unusual at all, especially during time of plague. So now what's got to be said out loud is that probably one of the crappiest jobs you can imagine is the cat who has the honor of digging those graves, right? Because what you're going to find when you start digging in the ground, yeah, it ain't going to be a pretty picture. See, they wouldn't put them in coffins, they just lay them in the ground. So the body's going to quickly disintegrate, but obviously there's going to be all kinds of body parts there. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe, of course, love this kind of, macabre type of thing where body parts are coming out of the ground, etc. But now let's talk about it in relationship to the opening lines of Act 5 of Hamlet. The very opening lines are spoken by grave diggers that Shakespeare himself called clowns. Now, the reason they're called clowns, and see, this is our problem. We think of clowns, we immediately think of, idiots dressed up with big red noses at circuses. That's not at all what we mean by clown. What we mean by clown here is jokers. They're guys who are going to tell jokes. They literally come on stage drinking wine, ale, while they're digging the grave. Now, the way apparently Shakespeare did this is he had a little kind of drop, in the stage that he created for the Globe. And so that when you saw this guy, you could see him from the waist up. And then what Shakespeare had was some dirt. And then this guy has a shovel, and he's literally kind of shoveling, you know, pretending like shoveling. And, no kidding, Shakespeare brought in bones to kind of make this more real, including skulls. Why would he need a skull? Because there's going to be a pivotal moment in Act 5 when a skull literally rolls across the stage of the Globe Theater. We're told several times it went a little bit too far and actually rolled out off the stage, and one of the groundlings had to pick it up and set the prop back up onto the stage. That prop of a skull is really important because Hamlet will be holding a skull as he makes his observations regarding Yorick, and this becomes iconically one of the most famous moments in all of literature, when you have Hamlet holding that skull there. But we don't start with a skull, we start with two idiots who are talking back and forth, making jokes about, notice the opening lines again. I told you Shakespeare loves the vague antecedent. He uses the pronoun she. And it takes, again, the audience just a quick observation. Oh, yeah, Ophelia died. Ophelia just committed suicide, we're told. And now notice the first clown will ask, is she to be buried in Christian burial that willingly seeks her own salvation? Which means what? Now it makes sense, right? In other words, how come we're burying her here closer to the cathedral or the church house when she committed suicide? In other words, this doesn't make sense. She shouldn't, if she committed gaining her own salvation here means taking her own life. The second clown will say, I tell thee she is. In other words, that's where we're supposed to be burying her. And therefore make her grave straight. And then on they begin to make kind of a back and forth. What's actually going on here? Shakespeare's playing multiple games with his intellectual audience. He has a couple of idiots debating theology, but what we're really talking about here is issues of power. In fact, one of them will flat out just say it. If she wasn't a gentlewoman, that is to say, if her father had been Polonius and if she wasn't so well connected to the king, we wouldn't be burying her here. We'd be burying her somewhere else. As the gravediggers are joking back and forth about who is it that was the very first man, Adam was a gentleman. He was not a gentleman. We're told he dug. How could you dig without arms? We're playing word games here. Of course, arms allow you to dig, but arms on a crest means that in England's day of 1600, still today, that you are a gentleman. That is to say your family has some worth, some power, and so we have some joking going back and forth. This returning to an earlier observation that Hamlet was making about how when you die, maggots don't seem to care whether you were a king or you were a beggar. And in fact, a beggar could get a worm that had eaten from a king's corpse. By the way, now that you kind of understand the way they buried, you can understand why this whole thing of worms and maggots is so easy to understand. Because obviously this ground is literally just crawling with maggots. I mean, obviously, right? That's the way that these bodies, these corpses are all going to dissolve so quickly. And so to have the job of being the gravedigger not only means that you're going to be working through all kinds of, human body remains, but obviously you're going to see a whole lot of, you're going to see a lot of worms, if you will, okay? So the word worms is going to start to kind of be a mantra almost in this play, and the way in which all of a sudden we started with an observation about how the world is an unweeded garden, and now we're going to end in a garden, but it's a garden of death, right? Here we are now in a cemetery where joking goes on. Enter Hamlet. And as he comes onto the stage, he comes on the stage with his pal Horatio, and he sees this guy digging a grave, but he's singing, and he's singing kind of like a Bawdry song. So it sets up the lines from Ophelia's little singing. And it's at this point that you start to have some kind of observations by Hamlet. I told you, each step is a little closer to death, ultimately his own death. And so he will begin to kind of go back and forth, and he'll ask the gravedigger, as the gravedigger is digging whose grave? Hamlet has no idea. To this degree, he's like Oedipus, who has no idea that Jocasta is his mother. Hamlet has no idea that he's standing beside his girl's grave, right? We will hear in a few minutes, Hamlet will scream really loud, I loved Ophelia. And it will reverberate off the walls of the theater when said well, to tell us Hamlet really did care for Ophelia, and the get thee to a nunnery scene was either him losing it and then being sad about that, or contrivances to try to get her away safe. And remember, that was kind of the last time he ever really talked to her, right? So he never really had any time to kind of patch things up. Let's point out, that's central to Shakespeare, isn't it? So Macbeth will come to the front of the stage as his wife is screaming off stage because she's committed suicide. He's told that she's dead of her own hand. And he says, there would have been time later to have a conversation with her. And then he says that famous set of lines, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in its petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. He laments the fact that it's over, and he's got no ability to be able to say anything to his girl. Of course, if you'll think about it, Othello was so caught up in getting justice on Desdemona that it doesn't occur to him that once she's dead, he can't talk to her anymore. He says, I will love you more after. And then he takes her life by strangling her, and then he's ready to have conversations with her. And of course, it's too late. Hamlet will be in somewhat a very similar circumstance, where his actions will ultimately lead to her death, but he has no clue of it now. Instead, he's standing next to the grave, and he starts to make some question about it. He says, whose grave is this, sir? And of course, the grave digger will say, it's mine. Of course, it's his, because why? He's the one digging it, right? Hamlet will ask, I think it be thine indeed, for thou liest in it. That is to say, you're standing in it. To which the gravedigger will come right back. You lie out on it, sir. In other words, I'm not the only liar. And notice how, this is amazing. This is brilliant for Shakespeare. Notice, what is the gravedigger doing to Hamlet? That Hamlet has been doing for the whole play. He's playing word games, words, words, words. Remember the very first time that we saw Hamlet, a little more than kin and less than kind. How is it that the clouds still hang on you? The king will ask him. Oh, not so. I'm too much in the sun. I've been sun tanning, S-O-N, tanning. Hamlet plays this all the way through the play. Now you've got this lowly gravedigger who's playing the same game with Hamlet. We should also point out, this is Shakespeare's way to as well show this gravedigger doesn't know who he's talking to. He's talking to the number 2 guy in all of the kingdom, the prince of the past King Hamlet, and he doesn't even know it. And so he kind of bantering back and forth with him. Notice, Hamlet will say, thou liest in it to be in it, and say it is thine, for 'tis for the dead, not for the quick. Therefore thou liest. In other words, he says, yeah, right, you can be quick with the tongue, but somebody else wasn't quick enough and now has to be laid into the grave. Of course, who's he talking about? Right, his girl, and he doesn't even understand it. 'Tis a quick lie, sir, 'twill away from me to you. What man's to be buried? What man dost thou dig for? No man. What woman? None neither. Who's to be buried in it? Notice again, we're playing word games, which is really what this whole play has been about. If you'll think about it, it's all been about word games. And the ways that we use words, as Stoppard will say in his play that you'll watch, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, words, it's all we've got to go on. The only thing we got to go on are words, and so we talk back and forth to each other. We text, we email, we talk on the phone. We use words all day long, words, words, words. But what actually do we say? And what meaning is there in all of these words? This is obviously one of the underlying subtexts of this play. One that was a woman, sir, but rest her soul. Usually is the way he does it. She's dead. The guy burying Ophelia has no emotional connection with Ophelia whatsoever. But as he's digging, he will throw out of the grave that skull, which will then allow for Hamlet to take one step closer to death by asking who the skull is. And the gravedigger says, oh, I know who he is. It's Yorick, the court clown, which immediately makes us think of Polonius, the other court fool or court jester. And he says, this idiot poured a flagon of wine over my head once. And Hamlet's like, no way. This is Yorick? Now, Yorick, when Hamlet was a little boy, was the court jester. And Hamlet will say, he was kind of my pal. And in that moment, Hamlet starts to kind of step a little closer to death. It becomes more real to him. And he holds up this skull. And he's looking at it. And now he speaks to Horatio and he says, I knew him, Horatio. He's holding Yorick. He says, when he had a face, he had lips that, as I was a young kid, he kissed me, I can remember, lots of times. And he used to tell jokes all the time. He'll speak to the skull and he'll ask, where's your joking now? Where is your laughing now? All, he says, quite chapfallen. That is to say, you have no lips with which to smile. You're nothing more than a skull. now. And this obviously takes us philosophically not only to Marcus Aurelius, who said, always look at people from their skeleton and you'll see what you need to see. And of course back to, we said yesterday, Plato, obviously, and the notion that we are so involved in the senses that when we look at people, we have a sense that this is what is real. But Yorick's skull is held in his hand. So you have a living Hamlet looking at a dead Yorick going, whoa, is it really you? And then, of course, he makes that really strange observation, get thee to my lady's chamber and tell her to paint it on an inch thick, for this is what she comes to. And as I already pointed out to you, the irony of all ironies, he went into Ophelia's chamber earlier in the play, dressed as he was crazy, looked right in her eyes, and then walked out without needing his eyes. Remember, as he was kind of looking at her, nodding up and down like, yeah, you are a part of this scam, aren't you? He probably was in her chamber before that, which is why we have some sense that maybe she's with child. Now he's saying, get to my lady's chamber, to her bedroom, and tell her, paint on the Maybelline, look really good, Victoria's Secret model, but in the end, you're going to look like Yorick. That's what you look like. All Sports Illustrated swimsuit models look like this. They just don't know it. If they did, they wouldn't care about being swimsuit models. It wouldn't matter to them, because this is what they get to come to. Of course, there's no skin on that skull, because maggots ate it all. And if you can capture that for a moment, you understand, of course, a philosophic tradition that says this doesn't mean as much as we like to think it means. We put a lot of emphasis in it. We think it matters, but that's only because we haven't picked up a skull recently. And all of a sudden, Hamlet's far more serious about this. He's no longer joking, but it is kind of a joke. Tell her to put on lots of makeup. The other thing that's funny here is that Queen Elizabeth didn't want to get old. She never got married. She always thought she was beautiful. When she was young, the reports are that she was kind of okay. But as she got older, she imagined herself getting younger, not older. One of the ways she did this is to take eggshell and stick it on her face, white eggshell, so that her skin would remain white porcelain. Which of course meant two things. It would smell as they stuck more and more eggshell on her face. She didn't wash to take it off. And it would crack if she smiled or opened her mouth too much. So she learned to talk like this, and you had to listen very closely. Up until she died. And then they keep, which is why old pictures of her, paintings of her, you can see the lines on the face. That's because of this eggshell. But it became the phenom among upper class women to stick eggshell as part of the makeup. Of course, for those of you that see this as completely asinine, I would say, really? Putting any number of things on the face that don't belong there naturally? Why? And now we're back to this whole question of what really is makeup and why is it necessary? What is it that is being covered, right? And of course, this is a little jab to any of the women who would be having, in that upper class of the Globe Theater, right then as they're watching it, painted on an inch thick. In the end, it doesn't matter how stunningly beautiful you are. You end up like you are. After maggots have taken care of all the thing called your skin. All that's left is this. And ultimately, of course, give it a few more years and you won't even have that, right? Because the bone itself will begin to decay. And then there's nothing but dirt, which is this next joke. What about Alexander the Great, he asks, the greatest man who ever lived. Do you think he ended up like this? Surely not. Alexander the Great did not decay like this. Horatio says, yeah, I think so. And Hamlet says, I wonder if he smelled this bad. I mean, think about it. That's the worst thing about graveyards is the stench, right? You have terrible smell. And then he makes a little joke that comes out as a ditty that Alexander the Great's body goes into the ground. It turns into dirt. The dirt becomes part of a mixture with cement to fill a hole in a wall. Alexander's ultimate life's goal was to become dirt that became cement so they could patch a hole in a wall. And that's what became of him. He's making that joke as Ophelia comes onto the stage. Hamlet and Horatio will hide. There are comments about, can't we give her a little bit more burial? And the priest will say, we got to be careful here because she took her own life. Laertes will jump down into the grave with Ophelia, showing his passion for his sister one more time. He will blame Hamlet. Hamlet comes out from behind the arrears, hiding, and immediately Laertes is ready to kill him. And it's at that point then that Hamlet will scream out loud, I loved Ophelia. The queen will try to protect her son by saying this is mere madness and all of that. But the reality is, the audience is split here as to who they root for. They understand Ophelia's death is in large measure really Hamlet's fault. And the last time he spoke to her, he didn't talk very nice to her anyway. And to that degree then, when Hamlet says, I loved Ophelia, it makes the audience begin to wonder, was he faking mad? Or did he actually lose his mind? I mean, you know, at points, did he lose his mind? We will finish then with the first scene and move very quickly then through the rest of the play. Scene 2 will allow for Hamlet and Horatio to have this conversation about how it was the case that he's on this boat. He walks in one night while R and G are sleeping, looks inside of their bag, finds a letter, opens the letter, he says to Horatio, and right there it is, from the hand of the king, put Hamlet to death. He says, I always hated school because I always asked the question, what will I ever need this crap for? For example, he said, they made me learn how to write like a king. But at that moment, I was really glad they did. Because I took out another piece of paper and I wrote a little note to the King of England that said that upon immediately opening this letter, the two guys named Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are to immediately be put to death. And he said, I folded it, I sealed it, because he said I still had my dad's old ring, and I sealed it. The next day, he says, pirates attacked our ship. I ended up jumping onto the pirate ship, and they sailed one direction. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern sailed towards England. So poor R&G are going to show up in England. Right. Notice we're still, right, see, notice we're still playing the game of death, right? And of course, the final lines of the play will be, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, right? That is to say, they show up, we've got our rules, we're supposed to deliver this letter, they deliver the letter, off with their heads kind of thing. Poor R&G and the fate of the universe. In the meantime, we've got to have, of course, the setup for the fight. Hamlet will say in 5-2, roughly line 74, so a man's life's no more than to say one. That is to say, the brevity of life. It's almost as if he already knows that it's over, that, you know, the end is coming. To know a man well, we're to know himself. Hamlet will say about himself at line 145 or so. And then ultimately at lines 230 or so, he will say, when Horatio says, dude, if you don't want to fight this sword fight, we don't have to do this. And Hamlet says, no, 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 not a whit. We, he says, defy augury. That is to say, omens, bad feelings. We got a bad feeling, we don't care. You know, you gotta live, you gotta die kind of thing. There's special providence in the fall of a sparrow. And then the genius of Shakespeare, to be or not to be, is what Hamlet had spoken earlier in Act 3. Now by Act 5, notice, if it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, it will come. The readiness is all. Lots and lots of philosophers have pointed out the genius of these lines. You can't choose without the option of suicide, to be or not to be. That is the question, whether his quietus might make with a bare bodkin. Without the option of suicide, you can't choose when you go. Death comes. Inevitably, we know. We never met any 200-year-old people. We know it's coming. We can drive by a graveyard in the town in which we live and realize that at some point, a tombstone there will be for us. That isn't a morbid thought unless you fear that. Why would you fear the fact that the sun comes up every morning? It's the natural thing. It's the readiness. And this sounds very much like, of course, Plato, right? The Phaedo comes to mind, Socrates' final words before he drinks his hemlock and dies. It's not a matter of dying. It's a matter of how one dies. The readiness is all. And it seems almost like Hamlet's like, yeah, all right, I kind of realize I killed old man Polonius. It probably is the end for me. The end of the play, as we've already said, is a sheer nightmare for a producer to produce. In the same way, this is a very difficult play to produce on stage, very hard. Because think about it, when you do that play within the play thing, you've got the play, then you've got all of the actors who are kind of, you know, watching the play, and then you've got the audience, who obviously want to be able to see what's happening in the play within the play, but they also want to be able to see, for example, the king's face, or Gertrude's face, or whatever, or Hamlet's face. How you set that up is tough. The same is true for the very end. So you've got Hamlet and Laertes sword fighting. Behind them, normally, you've got the king and queen on their thrones, right? And you're allowed to watch then multiple events happening simultaneously, like great Italian opera, where you have different voices singing simultaneously, and you have to pay attention to try and figure out what's being said or done. So you have fighting going on between the two. You got the king dropping his poison into the cup and all of that jazz. You got the queen drinking from the cup and then starting to jerk around on her throne as she gets ready to die. You got the king watching her going, hurry up and die so I don't get in trouble. You've got Hamlet getting wounded by Laertes and the swords dropping to the floor. Now they're back again. Hamlet giving 1 for 1 with a cut. And immediately Laertes realizing, crap, I'm dead. My own plan goes against me. And then in the meantime, the queen steps up, falls down onto the stage and says, the poison, the drink. Laertes then tells Hamlet it's all done. And Hamlet in that moment will realize he's dead. He will get his vengeance, but I mean, what difference does it make? And then it's the end of the play. What happens last? Hamlet will say, I need you, Horatio, to stay alive. He says, no way, I'm more antique Roman than a Dane. In other words, I'm ready to kill myself. And Hamlet says, no, I need you alive so that you can kind of explain what this whole play has been about. He seems to suggest that Horatio's supposed to tell the story, but leave his mom out of it. The rest is silence. There's any number of ways to define what that line means. Talk, but don't talk too much. Tell the story, but don't tell the story too much. And then Fortinbras comes on, which is difficult if you've edited out Fortinbras, because the question is, who's going to take over the kingdom after everybody that could run the kingdom is dead? Right? Fortinbras will be the one. Shakespeare always has to end his tragedies with some sense of normalcy, of continuation. The only place where that doesn't seem to really happen is Othello, where Iago never says he's sorry and says, I'd do it again if I had the chance. Ooh. And we kind of get a sense that there's not as much continuation at play as there is at the end of Macbeth, at the end of Hamlet, and of course here at the end of Lear. Thanks, guys. Oh, one other thing.